The morning fog clung to San Francisco streets like a shroud of forgotten dreams. Julia Hayes pulled her gray cardigan tighter as she approached the towering glass facade of Westwood Music Academy, her worn leather notebook pressed against her chest like armor. At 33, she had perfected the art of invisibility, crafting symphonies in shadow while others basked in spotlights. The Academy's marble lobby buzzed with nervous energy. Young musicians clutched their instruments like lifelines, whispering about today's visiting master, Constance Wellington, the critic whose reviews could launch careers or destroy them with surgical precision. Room 342, the receptionist said without looking up, sliding a visitor badge across the polished desk. "You're here for the composition seminar?" "Observation," Julia corrected quietly. "My publisher thought it would be beneficial." Inside the seminar room, 50 young performers sat in perfect rows, their instruments gleaming under harsh, fluorescent lights. Julia found an empty chair in the back corner, grateful for the shadows that had always been her sanctuary. The door burst open with theatrical force. Constance Wellington swept in like a storm given human form, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her black dress pristine as fresh ink. The room fell silent. "Music is not about playing notes correctly," Wellington announced, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "It is about bleeding truth through strings and keys. Today we will discover who among you has the courage to bleed." Her piercing gray eyes scanned the room methodically, cataloging each face with predatory interest. When her gaze reached Julia's corner, it lingered for a heartbeat longer than the others. "You!" Wellington said, pointing directly at Julia. "The composer hiding in the back. What is your name?" Every head in the room turned. Julia's throat constricted. "Julia Hayes. I'm just observing today." "Observing." Wellington's lips curved into something that might have been a smile on anyone else. "How very safe. Tell me, Miss Hayes, when did you last touch an instrument?" The question hit Julia like a physical blow. Around her, the room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer. She could smell the familiar scent of rosin and wood polish, could feel phantom calluses on her fingertips from years of practice. "I don't perform," Julia managed. "Interesting." Wellington approached with predatory grace, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Because I can smell the musician on you. It clings to composers who once played like smoke in fabric." Julia's hands trembled as Wellington stopped directly in front of her chair. This close, she could see the older woman's eyes weren't just gray but flecked with silver, like storm clouds about to break. "There's a violin in the corner gathering dust," Wellington said softly, her voice now intimate, dangerous. "Play something for us." "I can't." The words came out strangled. "Can't?" Wellington's eyebrows arched. "Or won't." The room had become a pressure cooker of anticipation. 50 pairs of eyes bore into Julia, waiting for her to crumble or rise. Her notebook fell to the floor with a soft thud, pages of carefully composed music scattering like fallen leaves. Wellington leaned closer, close enough that Julia could smell her perfume, sharp and unforgiving as winter air. "What are you so afraid of, Miss Hayes?" The silence stretched like a taut string ready to snap. Julia's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as Wellington's question hung in the air between them. The room felt suffocating, thick with expectation and the scent of polished wood. "I said I can't," Julia whispered, but her voice betrayed her, cracking on the final word. Wellington straightened slowly, her expression shifting from predatory interest to something resembling understanding. She turned to address the class. "Clear the room," she commanded. "All of you. Return in 30 minutes." The students exchanged confused glances but obeyed without question. Chairs scraped against floor, instruments were hastily packed, and whispered conversations faded as the door closed with a soft click. Now it was just Julia and Wellington in the vast, echoing space. 15 years of training doesn't disappear," Wellington said, walking toward the corner where an old violin case sat forgotten on a music stand. "I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, the slight curve of your left fingers. You were good, weren't you?" Julia's hands clenched in her lap. "Good enough to fail when it mattered most." Wellington opened the case with practiced ease, revealing a violin that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. The wood gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights, and even from across the room, Julia could smell the familiar mixture of varnish and old rosin. "Juilliard?" Wellington asked, lifting the instrument with reverence. Julia's breath hitched. "How did you know?" "Because I failed there too." Wellington's admission fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock across Julia's carefully constructed understanding of the woman before her. 27 years ago, I froze during my audition just like you did." The violin looked impossibly fragile in Wellington's hands as she approached Julia's chair. This close, Julia could see the tiny imperfections in the instrument's surface, the accumulated wisdom of decades of music making. "The difference between us," Wellington continued, "is that I never stopped playing. I just changed the rules of the game." She held out the violin like an offering, like a challenge, like a loaded weapon. "Play," Wellington said, her voice softer now, but no less commanding. "Not for them, not for me. Play for the girl who bled for this music before fear stole her voice." Julia's hands shook as she reached for the instrument. The moment her fingers made contact with the familiar curve of the neck, 15 years of suppressed muscle memory flooded back. Her left hand found the fingerboard like coming home, while her right hand trembled as it gripped the bow. She brought the violin to her shoulder, feeling the smooth wood against her chin, the weight she had carried for so many years before casting it aside. Wellington watched with an intensity that felt almost intimate. Julia drew the bow across the strings in a tentative, whispered note. The sound that emerged was raw, uncertain, but unmistakably alive. It filled the empty room like a confession. "Again," Wellington whispered. "But this time, let it hurt." Julia closed her eyes and played the opening measures of Bach's Partita No. 2, the piece she had been practicing when her world collapsed at Juilliard. Her fingers found the notes with surprising accuracy, but her bow work was unsteady, emotional rather than precise. The music built slowly, gathering strength like a storm. Julia felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. She poured 15 years of silence into those strings, 15 years of hiding behind other people's performances. When she finally lowered the instrument, the room felt different, charged with the electricity of something profound and dangerous. Wellington was standing closer now, close enough to touch. "Beautiful," she said, and there was something raw in her voice, something vulnerable that hadn't been there before. "Flawed, but beautiful." Julia looked up to find Wellington's gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with performance anxiety. "Who are you really?" Julia asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Wellington smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "Someone who recognizes a kindred spirit when she hears one play." 3 weeks later, Julia found herself in Wellington's private studio, a converted warehouse in the Mission District that felt more like a sanctuary than a practice space. Exposed brick walls absorbed sound like secrets, and antique instruments hung from the ceiling like sleeping ghosts. "Your vibrato is still tense," Wellington observed from the leather armchair where she sat with a glass of wine, watching Julia practice. "You're holding back." Julia lowered her violin with a frustrated sigh. These evening sessions had become a ritual, ostensibly about rebuilding her technique, but increasingly about something neither of them was willing to name. "I'm trying," Julia said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "No." Wellington rose and crossed the room with that familiar predatory grace. "You're protecting yourself." "There's a difference." She stopped behind Julia, close enough that Julia could feel the warmth radiating from her body. When Wellington's hands covered hers on the violin, adjusting her grip, Julia's breath caught. "Music requires vulnerability," Wellington murmured, her lips near Julia's ear. "You have to be willing to break open." The instruction was about music, but Julia felt it resonate deeper, in places she'd kept carefully guarded since Juilliard. "Since before Juilliard." "Constance?" Julia began, then stopped. They'd been using first names for a week now, but the intimacy of it still felt dangerous. "What? Why are you helping me?" Wellington's hand stilled on hers. In the mirror across the room, Julia could see their reflection. Two women frozen in an embrace that looked more intimate than any lesson had a right to be. "Because I see myself in you," Wellington said finally. "The person I could have been if I'd been braver." She stepped back abruptly, leaving Julia cold in the sudden absence of her presence. "Again," Wellington commanded, returning to her chair, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Julia played, but her mind wandered to the way Wellington's facade cracked sometimes, revealing glimpses of the wounded musician beneath the feared critic. She'd learned that Wellington lived alone in this vast space, surrounded by instruments she rarely played anymore. She'd learned that Wellington's reviews, so cutting to others, were written with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly how much it hurt to fail. The piece Julia was playing shifted into a minor key, something mournful and complex. When she finished, she found Wellington watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "There's something you should know," Wellington said, her voice carefully controlled, "about why I sought you out." Julia set down her violin, a cold weight settling in her stomach. "I didn't just happen to be at the academy that day," Wellington continued. "Your publisher contacted me months ago. He wanted me to evaluate your work, determine if you had potential beyond composition." The words hit Julia like physical blows. "You were hired to assess me?" "Initially, yes." Wellington's knuckles were white where she gripped her wine glass. "But that's not why I'm here now." "Then why?" Julia's voice was rising, anger and hurt bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. "Why these private lessons? Why the intimacy? Was it all part of the evaluation?" Wellington stood abruptly, crossing to the window that overlooked the glittering city lights. Her reflection in the glass looked haunted. "Because somewhere between that first lesson and tonight I stopped caring about your publisher's money," she said. "I stopped caring about anything except the way you sound when you play with your guard down." Julia felt her world tilting. "You're saying this is real?" Wellington turned, and in her eyes Julia saw the same fear she'd carried for 15 years, the terror of being seen completely and found wanting. "I'm saying I'm falling in love with the music you make," Wellington said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm terrified of what that means." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared cross. Julia's heart pounded so loudly she was certain Wellington could hear it in the sudden silence. But before either could speak, Wellington's phone buzzed on the piano. She glanced at it, and her face went pale. "What is it?" Julia asked. Wellington looked up, and Julia saw something like panic in those storm-gray eyes. "Your publisher wants to meet with both of us tomorrow," she said. "He's ready for my final evaluation." The publisher's office felt like a courtroom, all mahogany and judgment. Richard Moss sat behind his imposing desk, fingers steepled as he studied the papers before him. Julia perched on the edge of her chair, violin case at her feet, while Wellington sat with characteristic poise that didn't quite mask the tension in her shoulders. "Miss Wellington," Moss began, "your report was quite thorough, though I must say some of the language was unexpected." Julia's stomach clenched. She hadn't seen Wellington's evaluation, but the way Constance avoided her eyes this morning suggested something was wrong. "I pride myself on honesty," Wellington replied coolly. Moss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Indeed, phrases like technically adequate but lacking emotional authenticity and unlikely to connect with professional performers were particularly illuminating. The words hit Julia like a physical assault. She turned to stare at Wellington, whose face had gone carefully blank. "Constance?" Julia's voice came out small, wounded. "However," Moss continued, seeming to enjoy the drama, "Miss Wellington also noted significant improvement during your sessions together. She believes with proper guidance you might develop into a competent performer." Julia felt sick. "Competent?" Wellington finally met her eyes, and what Julia saw there wasn't remorse but something harder, more calculating. "I told you music requires vulnerability," Wellington said quietly. "What I didn't mention is that vulnerability in this business gets you destroyed." "You wrote that I was inadequate?" "I wrote that you needed protection," Wellington snapped, her composure cracking. This industry will chew you up and spit you out. At least this way you can keep composing without the pressure to perform." Julia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You made that choice for me? I made the choice that would keep you safe." "Safe?" Julia's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Or did you make the choice that would keep me dependent on you?" The accusation landed like a slap. Wellington's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You want to know what I really wrote?" she asked, rising to her feet. "I wrote that you have more raw talent than half the musicians at Carnegie Hall. I wrote that your emotional connection to music could make audiences weep. I wrote that you could be extraordinary if you could overcome your fear." "Then why?" "Because I also wrote that you're fragile," Wellington continued, her voice rising. "I wrote that public performance might break you completely. I wrote that I'd seen what this world does to sensitive souls and I couldn't bear to watch it happen to you." Moss cleared his throat. "Ladies, if we could return to business?" "No." Julia grabbed her violin case, backing toward the door. "I'm done being managed and protected and evaluated like some kind of specimen." "Julia, wait!" Wellington reached for her, but Julia pulled away. "You made me trust you," Julia said, her voice shaking with rage and heartbreak. "You made me believe in myself again, and then you sabotaged me behind my back. I was trying to save you. From what? From choosing my own life?" Julia yanked open the door, then paused, looking back at Wellington with tears streaming down her face. "You know what the real tragedy is? I was falling in love with you. Not just the teacher, not just the critic, but you, the broken musician hiding behind all that armor." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But love without trust is just beautiful destruction." She walked out, leaving Wellington standing in the wreckage of what they'd built together. But Julia didn't go home. Instead, she found herself at the Westwood Academy, standing in the same practice room where this had all begun. The old violin still sat in its corner, waiting. She opened the case and lifted the instrument, feeling its familiar weight. Then she began to play, not the careful exercises Wellington had assigned, but something raw and improvised, born from heartbreak and betrayal and the strange, terrible gift of loving someone who couldn't let themselves be loved in return. Students gathered outside the door, drawn by the sound of music that was technically imperfect but emotionally devastating. Julia played until her fingers bled, poured everything into those strings, her grief, her anger, her shattered trust, and underneath it all, the love that remained despite everything. When she finally stopped, the hallway outside had filled with listeners. Through the glass window, she could see their faces, moved and shaken by what they'd heard. At the back of the crowd, Wellington stood watching, tears streaming down her face. 6 months later, Julia stood backstage at Davies Symphony Hall, her hands steady for the first time in 15 years. The program listed her as both composer and performer of Elegy for Broken Trust, a piece born from heartbreak and refined through countless hours of solitary practice. The audience beyond the curtain buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread through San Francisco's music community about the mysterious composer who had finally emerged from the shadows, who played with a raw emotionality that left listeners shattered and healed in equal measure. 5 minutes, Miss Hayes," the stage manager whispered. Julia nodded, adjusting her black dress, the one she'd chosen specifically because it was nothing like the gray cardigan she'd hidden behind for so long. She'd earned every thread of this transformation through blood and tears, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding herself without Wellington's shadow. She hadn't seen Constance since that day at the academy, though she'd heard the rumors. Wellington had stopped writing reviews, had retreated into her warehouse studio like a hermit. Some said she was working on her own performance comeback. Others whispered that she'd simply disappeared into the music that had always been her first love. The curtain rose, and Julia walked into the spotlight she'd spent half her life fleeing. The audience fell silent as she raised her violin, and for one heartbeat, she thought of Wellington, of the way her eyes had looked when Julia played for her that first time. Then she began. The music that flowed from her instrument told a story without words. It spoke of fear conquered and trust broken, of love that persisted despite betrayal, of the courage required to stand naked before the world and offer your heart on a silver platter. The melody soared and shattered, rebuilt itself and soared again, a phoenix of sound that transformed pain into beauty. In the third movement, as the music reached its most vulnerable passage, Julia saw her in the audience. Wellington sat in the back row, her silver hair catching the dim light, her face wet with tears. Their eyes met across the darkness, and Julia felt her chest constrict with the force of recognition, of love that had never died despite everything. But Julia didn't falter. Instead, she played harder, pouring everything she'd learned about strength and solitude and the terrible courage of standing alone into those strings. The music became a conversation between past and present, between the woman who had hidden behind others' performances and the one who had learned to bleed her truth into her own. When the final note faded into silence, the audience erupted. Julia stood in the cascade of applause, feeling tears stream down her face, knowing she had finally become the musician she was always meant to be. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, Julia found Wellington waiting by the stage door. They stood facing each other in the alley behind the concert hall, the weight of 6 months of silence between them. "You were magnificent," Wellington said, her voice hoarse. "I was myself," Julia replied. "Finally." Wellington nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. "I brought you something." She held out a small box, worn velvet, that spoke of age and significance. Inside lay a silver pin shaped like a violin, tarnished but beautiful. "It was my mother's," Wellington said. "She gave it to me before my first performance. I've been waiting for someone worthy to pass it on to." Julia's fingers trembled as she took the pin. "Constance, I was wrong," Wellington interrupted. "About protecting you, about choosing your path, about thinking I could love you without letting you choose whether to love me back." She stepped closer, close enough that Julia could smell her familiar perfume. "I was wrong about everything except this. You are extraordinary." Julia fastened the pin to her dress, right over her heart. "What happens now?" Wellington smiled, and for the first time since Julia had known her, it was without armor or calculation. "Now you decide," she said. "You've learned to stand alone. The question is whether you want to learn to stand together." Julia looked at this woman who had broken her heart and taught her to heal it, who had tried to save her by nearly destroying her, who had loved her enough to let her go and been brave enough to come back. "I'm not the same person who fell in love with you," Julia said. "Neither am I," Wellington replied. "Perhaps that's exactly what we need." Julia reached for Wellington's hand, feeling the calluses from years of playing, the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. They had both learned the cost of love without trust, had both paid the price for trying to protect instead of cherish. But they had also learned that some music can only be made by two instruments playing in harmony, creating something neither could achieve alone. "Then let's learn together," Julia said. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. They walked into the San Francisco fog hand in hand, two broken musicians who had found a way to make beautiful music from their scars. The end.